Sorry, folks, I was not paying attention here.
Two of our folks on the CEP are having trouble seeing the slides. Marnie Magda and Martha McNicholas. So any advice that you have would be terrific.
Well, at this point, I would suggest to rejoin the meeting, if that's possible, and then we'll make you as presenters so you can see that again.
Okay. So before anybody rolls off, so I know Marnie and Martha, you'll do that. If anybody else is going to roll off, if you could just raise your hand.
We go off and start again?
Yes. So quote unquote leave the meeting. See the red button at the top right?
Yeah.
You should see leave, and then just go back to the meeting notice and rejoin, please.
Okay.
Come. Make sure you come back, Marnie.
Right.
Yeah. And just folks, the buttons are in different places depending on how you're logging in through this. So if you're on the app, and you're not in the organization, then their buttons will be on the bottom, but they look like a hang up button, and the button looks like a mute button, and the hand button looks like hand. So it sounds like maybe I see 3 hands from guests that maybe can't see that as well. And so if you can't see the slides, why don't you exit and then quickly come back in, and then hopefully that resolves the problem. So we'll see you in just a moment, Marnie. And then I want to go to you, Doug, to give the big picture at songs. The slides have been circulated in advance, so folks have the slides separate from that. But maybe you could get started on the big picture, and then hopefully we'll get everybody back online in a little bit.
Okay, I will, David. Thanks for that. I was going to ask whether you wanted me to continue while folks are leaving and rejoining, but Julie, why don't we just go right to the next slide, slide 10. We show this slide every meeting because it's meaningful every meeting. These are our decommissioning principles. Safe and prompt deconstruction is at the top. We're going to talk a little bit tonight, Vince will, about some of the specific deconstruction activities that we're excited about. We also continue to safely store our spent fuel on site, and that's actually part of our overall plan, and we'll continue to do that to the extent that we need to. And then moreover, tonight we'll talk about efforts to relocate the spent fuel off-site, and that'll be the majority content of our meeting tonight. If you'd advance to slide 11, please. Okay, the big picture here is, dismantlement is now in process. We're at the point now where we're ready to start taking down some administrative buildings. We're doing some more heavy construction work inside the unit containment structures, the large domes that you see when you drive by on Route 5. And so that work is in progress, and it's going to involve a lot of waste shipments. Most of those shipments will be via a railroad, and Vince will spend a little bit of time covering this coming up. As we've already indicated, we completed the strategic plan to relocate Song's spent fuel to an off-site facility. That plan was rolled out officially on Monday of this week, and we plan to talk in more detail about that tonight. That plan involved years of work. The Northwinds team, the experts team, and assistants, folks from here facilitating that. So we do think it's a very meaningful set of documents. Moving on to slide 12. You'll hear more about this a little later in the evening, but there's some priorities established with our strategic plan. One, restarting federal spent fuel management program. In general, federal spent fuel program support is needed. Our plan calls for federal supported consolidated interim storage in tandem with restarting a permanent geologic repository. And the reason for that is it's not reasonable to think that consolidated interim storage would be permanent. It's interim storage for a reason. And so the two need to work together. And then for pursuance of legislative priorities through advocacy, our SE action plan calls for just that, and we'll talk some more about that this evening. And that also involves advancing legislative solutions. And fifth is undertaking near-term efforts to ensure that the Song site and the 123 fuel canisters that we have here are going to be ready to be shipped when a disposal facility is available. And that's no small task, but we're up to it, and that's also part of our action plan. Our plan builds in optionality for durability over time, and it considers, as options may change, how we would refocus our priorities. Yeah, Julie, you can go to slide 13, please. So I just wanted to point out, we're continuing with our quarterly updates. The last Trifold About Songs was mailed out in February. It's also available online. And although the link here would make you think it's connected to Amazon Web Services, it's actually available on the songscommunity.com website, where you can find updates, those quarterly updates on our decommissioning activities. We will send the next update in April, and we're actually pretty excited about some of the work going on here to move forward with the above-ground dismantlement of our facilities. With that, I'll turn it over to Vince, who will provide some more details on the Songs decommissioning update.
Let me just pause for just a moment to see whether any of the CEP members have any questions or comments about this before we move on. And Martha, if you could mute your line, or maybe Sanjay, somebody could just pay attention to all the lines, because we got a lot of people on, and if we have open lines, we have a lot of background noise. I don't see any CEP members wanting to take the floor. So let me go to Vince Bilowski, who's going to give us an update on, in particular, where the dismantlement process stands before we get to our main item tonight. Vince?
Thanks, David. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Great. Okay, so we can go to slide 15. First, I want to provide a brief update on the batch releases of treated water. Shown here is the diagram of our treatment system that we use. It consists of mechanical filters, ion exchangers, and these clean the water prior to the testing, diluting, and releasing. The current schedule calls for the next release to occur this summer, either in June or July, and then not again until the end of the year or early 2022. Okay, so that's where we are with the water releases. If we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to show some pictures of the activities that are happening on the project now. On the left here is a picture of the reactor cavity, which is flooded with water. So this was taken during a refueling outage several years ago. The bridge that those workers are standing on is a big part of the refueling machine, and that item has now been removed from both units. On the right, you can see a portion of the machine structure, and that's being taken out using the overhead crane inside the containment building. So we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, here's an overhead view of the station, and we've circled the buildings that are scheduled to be demolished this year. We'll actually be tearing down the first building next week. If you look at the two buildings that are circled on the right, the top one is going to be the first one to come down. Then this summer, we'll take down the one below that, and then in the fall, we're going to knock down that big administrative office building in the upper left corner there. And once all that rubble is cleared away, that's the location where we're going to lay down some more rail car tracks so we can get more rail cars in and out of the plant to carry out the waste. To do the demolition work, we're going to be using mainly hammer trucks as the primary tool, so nothing spectacular like explosives or wrecking balls or anything like that. It'll be a highly controlled, methodical process. So we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, here we're looking at the cavity that's next to the reactor. In that previous slide with the refueling machine, it was flooded with water, and now you're seeing it the way it is right now. It's dry, and we're installing the equipment that'll be used to cut the reactor internals into pieces. Once that equipment is installed, that cavity is going to be filled up with water one last time. All the operation of cutting the internals is done underwater, and the tools will operate there. They'll cut the internals into pieces, and those pieces will be sorted by their activity levels and placed into sealed containers. The level of activity will determine where they're going to be exposed. They're either going to be disposed or stored on site next to the fuel that's the fuel that's stored in the horizontal new home system. That's going to be for the greater than Class C pieces. The Class B and C pieces are going to go to the facility in Andrews, Texas, and Class A are going to go to Clive, Utah, with just about everything else that's inside the containment buildings. So we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, here we're looking at the first stage of the dismantlement of a fairly large component inside the containment building. It's called a safety injection tank. These are tanks that held borated water during operation. There's 4 of them in each unit. In this case, a cutting torch was used to cut around the top circumference of the tank, and then the overhead crane is used to take that top portion off. We're calling that a lid here. Once that lid's gone, the workers proceed with cutting the tank into segments and then sending them out for disposal again to the Clive, Utah facility.
Let me just pause for a moment and ask Ted.
Sure. Yeah.
Get through. I just had, yeah, you hear me okay?
I can hear you, Ted.
Okay. The question has to do with, say, pressurizer or steam generators. Are these in just staging as you go through? I see what you're doing on the outside or the inside containment outs. At what point do you get to the generators or the pressurizer?
So that won't be until, those are the large components, and that won't be for about another year and a half until they start segmenting those. They'll be segmented and removed.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
Reactor pumps will be cut in 2 pieces. Yep.
Dan Stetson?
No, I'm fine. Thank you, David.
Okay, thanks. I don't see any others, so Vince, why don't you carry on?
Okay, I think we can go ahead to the next slide here. Okay, on this side, on the left, we're looking at a very typical container that's used, and it's filled with very typical waste from the containment building. The container here is called an intermodal, and that's a standard container that's used. What's inside there is, looks like we have some cable trays, some cabinets, some metallic insulation, and small pipes. When that intermodal is full at its capacity, a lid is secured on top of it, and then as we see on the right there, that's one of those intermodals being loaded into the rail car. And once the rail car has its number of intermodals inside it, another lid goes on top of the rail car, and that's when it can be shipped out. Again, that would go to Clive, Utah by rail. And we're going to I think this is the last slide. Yep. This is a picture of a pipe that is in the primary coolant circulation system. That's the closed piping loop that's used to bring water from the reactor to the steam generator and then back to the reactor again. These pipes are designed to sustain very high temperatures, high pressures, high flow rates. They're really big and thick. They can have an outer diameter of up to 4 feet and a wall thickness of over 4 inches. We found that the best tool to cut these with is a diamond wire saw, and that's what you're looking at in this picture. It's a pulley system that has a cable with diamond studs laced through it. So that's all I have to present today. Stop and see if anybody has any questions.
Thank you very much, Vince. Let me just pause for a moment to see if there are any questions or comments. Okay. I don't see anybody from...
David?
Yep, go ahead.
It's Martha.
Go ahead.
Just refresh my memory. Class A is the least radioactive group of debris, and B and C, and then greater than C. Is that, am I assuming correctly on that?
Correct. You have that correct. Yes, A is the most benign. It makes up more than 99% of all the waste. B and C are in the middle. Greater than Class C is what's treated like it's full. It's still low-level waste, but it's higher activity. So we treat it like it's fuel. It's stored in canisters that are very similar to the fuel canisters, and they're going to go into the modules, horizontal storage modules. There'll be 12, probably 12 more of those.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you very much. I don't see any other questions, so why don't we move on now to the next segment. Thank you very much for that, Vince. So the next topic and the main topic for tonight is the strategic plan. As you know, a team of experts, extraordinary team of experts at the top of their game, highly skilled and knowledgeable about spent fuel issues in this country, and the details really matter, and that comes out very clearly from the materials that they've put together. They briefed us with a kind of interim report at our last meeting on November 19th. We then asked them to rejoin us when their analysis was complete, and their analysis is now complete, and they're here tonight. It comes in 3 volumes, the strategic plan element, a conceptual transportation plan, and then an action plan. And the last of those 3 is really a statement of what Edison is going to do with this material. And the first of those 2, the strategic plan and the conceptual transportation plan, work out a whole bunch of different options and the consequences of going down different paths in very pragmatic terms, focused on what's really doable, what's really feasible from a commercial and a community point of view. And I hope folks have had a chance to review those plans. I've read them fully. It was a long read, but a really interesting read. It's a substantial. I think the nation's forests are trembling right now, having printed them out. And they're very, very impressive in detail and nuance, and in particular in their core conclusion around federal policy shifts. And we'll have a chance to get into that in more detail tonight. So I'm going to ask Manuel to introduce our guest speakers from the team, and then we'll give the floor over to them to make a presentation, and then we'll have a discussion. Manuel?
Yep. Thank you, David. Yeah, been a long time coming, the last couple of years working on this, and we have brought in a number of experts, as you say. Let me just pause, though. I should say that I did see that at least Charles is saying he can't see the slides, so I'm not sure when you joined, but earlier when some folks were having trouble, the advice was to leave the meeting and then come back. So if anybody's still having trouble seeing the slides, that's the suggestion, is kind of hang up from the meeting, and then if you can rejoin, should be able to fix the issue.
Well, maybe this, Manuel, before you go on, let me test this with Marnie and Martha. Can you see the slides? Did that?
No, I've pulled them up separately and I'm following along on my own set of slides. So it's not live, but I'm following along.
And Marnie, can you see the slides on your screen?
So David, this is Sanjay. It looks like Microsoft might be having a problem where some of the users in the browser cannot see it. What I've done is on the chat, I've posted a link to the presentation, so the folks who cannot watch it, if you could follow along, that will be nice.
Okay, so follow the link that's in the chat, and then everybody needs to say what slide they're on. And currently we're on slide, this cover slide here is slide 22. And so back to you, Emmanuel.
Thank you, David. Yeah, sorry for the trouble there. Okay, so we did bring in a number of experts. Let me just briefly introduce those folks, and I'll turn it over. Among the experts that we brought in, we did have the Northwind team, and that's the organization that actually did the assessment for us and wrote the plan, and then also the experts team. And you've heard from these folks before, back in November. So joining us tonight, we do have Tom Isaacs. Tom has more than 30 years experience in spent fuel management. He was a senior advisor to the President's Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future, and also, in addition to advising Southern California Edison on this issue, he advises the Canadian equivalent of the Department of Energy. It's called the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. So I thank Tom for joining us. Also, we have Joe Heiser. Joe Heiser is with EJM Associates, and that's EJM is in Ernest J. Moniz, former Secretary of the Department of Energy, and Joe has significant experience as well on the DOE side. He is former senior advisor to the Secretary during the time that he was the head of DOE and Chief Financial Officer. Also from Northwind, we have Brian Gutherman. Brian, welcome. Brian he's a regulatory affairs specialist with more than 30 years of experience. And then finally rounding out the team that's with us tonight anyway is Elizabeth Helvey. And Elizabeth, her specialty is stakeholder engagement as it relates to spent fuel transportation. And she also served as the project director for the team that did the assessment and actually wrote the strategic plan and the conceptual transportation plan. So with that, David, let me turn it over to Joe Heiser to move through some of the content. And Joe, as David suggests, if you could just make sure you indicate which slide you're on.
Okay, great. Thanks, Manuel, for that great introduction. And welcome. And we appreciate the opportunity to meet with the CEP and to members of the public to talk about the strategic plan that we've been working on now for quite some time. And the slide 22 here is the title of the plan. And as the title says, our focus was really to look at offsite storage or repository alternatives. So our focus was really not to look at on-site, but rather where can we safely move the spent nuclear fuel to either a storage or to a permanent repository site. I'm going to go through these slides, and I'll just say in advance that I'm going to ask Tom Isaacs and Brian Gutherman to jump in on a couple of these slides as I go through them. So if you go to slide 23, this is kind of a snapshot of the messages that we'd like to leave with you tonight. First is I'll go through a few slides that really are just a recap of what we presented back in November at the last CEP meeting. And then secondly, spend a few minutes talking about new developments that we see happening at federal and state government levels and also internationally. And then the main focus will be to focus on the strategic plan and its elements. And there's really four main messages that we want to leave you with this evening. The first is that within the strategic plan, the principal focus is on finding an offsite consolidated storage alternative that will align with the SONG's decommissioning plan. And as we'll talk about a little bit more, there's multiple variations on that theme. The second theme is that obviously that in parallel with this, there's a need to begin work again on a consent-based repository program because the two of these need to move forward in tandem, not necessarily on the same schedule, but at least to move forward in tandem. The third theme really that we want to leave you with is that reestablishing the responsibility of the federal government to lead on this is really the key to moving forward. And then the last point is that we really need to develop a coalition effort to take the ideas in the plan and translate them into action. And I think that'll be part of the discussion then that will transition over to the SCE team. So if you go to slide 24, again, these are some slides actually I think very similar to what we presented back in November. Obviously, the strategic planning effort started out as a requirement of the settlement agreement, but really what we tried to do is turn it into an opportunity to find a reasonable pathway, an opportunity to influence how the federal government can restart a national program, an opportunity to provide some new and unique insights because we developed this plan from a utility and a customer perspective and not necessarily from a governmental perspective. And then last but not least, we tried to create a platform here that would enable the SONG's co-owners to take actions as the circumstances present themselves. On slide 25, as David and Emmanuel described, we produced three documents. The first document, the action plan, is really an SCE document that really pivots off of the second and the third volumes. And again, I won't repeat the fact that this was a team of many subject matter experts and that we were advised by a special experts team that was chaired by Tom Isaacs, and then obviously an internal SCE team that reviewed and provided input into our analysis. On slide 26, the goal of the strategic plan obviously is to provide for the safe, commercially reasonable relocation of the spent fuel to another facility, restore the site, and allow the site to be returned to the Navy. And in doing so, we were looking at opportunities for timely off-site disposition. We carefully compared various alternatives with DOE's contractual obligations. One of our other objectives was also to prevent incremental costs to customers, and also to avoid unrecoverable costs to customers. And then last but not least, to make sure that the SCE customers are protected from any residual liability risk once the spent nuclear fuel physically leaves the site. So if you move on then to slide 27, this then just in a very capsule summary way summarizes the alternatives that we looked at. We started out with a much wider net of alternatives, and then we focused down to these alternatives as ones in which we did a deeper dive analysis. And in the strategic plan, you will see that each of these alternatives is addressed in some detail. Looking at the alternatives, a lot of it has to do with when and how the federal government takes title, and whether they do that at a storage facility or a repository, or if they do not take title, what alternatives are available to the SONG's co-owners to move the spent nuclear fuel to either a non-federal storage facility, some other facility within the site, or some form of a multi-utility or other variant alternative. On slide 28, the next slide, we developed 4 principal criteria that we used in evaluating each of the alternatives. And we applied these comprehensively and uniformly across each of the alternatives that we analyzed. Obviously, technical safety and regulatory feasibility was a critical factor. Commercial reasonableness, as was defined in the settlement agreement, was a major factor. The timeliness for off-site disposition, and then last but not least, implementation feasibility issues. So with that, I'll go to slide 29 and then begin to talk a little bit about what's new. And in particular, there have been some major new events that have occurred since we last talked to you at the November CEP meeting. First and foremost, we've now had a change in presidential administrations, and in particular now with the new Biden administration and a new Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, who at her confirmation hearing made a very clear commitment to proceeding with nuclear waste, both storage and permanent disposal, using a consent-based process. In addition to that, at the end of the last Congress, there were several major pieces of legislation that were enacted. One was a comprehensive energy authorization bill called the Energy Act of 2020. And in that bill included a 5-year authorization for research, development, demonstration, and commercial application of a variety of options for storage, disposal, and transportation. The final language in that bill incorporated language from earlier bills that were introduced by Representative Levin, and also included language that was in another bill that was co-sponsored by Representatives Lamb and Newhouse. And then in parallel, as part of that same comprehensive package, there were appropriations provided to DOE for restarting the nuclear waste program. And this is significant because this is the first time in 10 years that Congress appropriated new monies to begin work on nuclear waste storage and disposition. And in particular, $20 million was provided for interim storage program for DOE to begin moving forward to look at a federal interim storage facility option using a consent-based approach. And $18 million additional was provided for preparation of spent nuclear fuel looking at activities at stranded sites such as songs, and to begin to look at reinitiation of regional transport, and including planning for the removal of spent fuel from sites near cities and Indian reservations. So while it's small amounts of money, I think it's an important first start, and we're looking forward now to the new administration beginning to take these funds and move forward. And that'll we'll talk more about that later when we get to the discussion about coalition. So on slide 30, this summarizes where we're at in terms of other developments on the international front. And I'll pause here and let Tom Isaacs comment on this slide.
Thank you, Joe. So for us to be successful, it's going to require government action. It's going to require state action, local government action, action by communities that are affected, by the local citizenry, by NGOs. And so it makes sense, in my experience, to always take a look at what lessons you can learn both here and abroad in putting together programs that have the best chance of success. So I just want to quickly go through for you a few items of places where progress is being made or changes are happening that might inform how the U.S. can come back to having a robust, vibrant, and successful program. So let me just mention to you that the Canadian program came to a standstill about 20 years ago. It was stopped, much like the U.S. program. Restarted, a new organization was formed called the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, which undertook consent-based siting as an approach to siting for a repository. They went forward and asked communities if they were interested in learning about this process, and 22 communities raised their hand, not to say they were on to volunteer, but that they were interested in learning what it meant to go forward as a candidate for a repository. And over the succeeding years, Canadian NWMO successively worked with these communities and down-selected communities based on the scientific and technical promise of the sites that they had to permanently and safely isolate the waste, as well as meeting the needs of these communities in terms of their socio-political desires for the future. They are now down to 2 sites in Canada that are the final remaining sites for hosting a repository, and have a commitment that by 2023, they will select one of these 2 sites that will include a partnership agreement, presumably, between NWMO and the selected community on how they will work together to both meet the needs of disposing of the spent fuel in Canada and meet the needs of the host community. In Finland, as many of you may know, they are probably the world's leader in the development of a geologic repository. Today, there are no geologic repositories for the disposition, the final disposal of spent fuel, but the Finns are almost there. They have received their construction license, and they are right now in the process of finishing the paperwork that will allow them to go to the regulator for an operational license to begin disposing of the fuel. I don't know that they have a final schedule, but I think you can expect in the next 2 to 3 years that Finland will open for operation their geologic repository, which is intended to dispose of all the finished spent fuel. Another interesting development lately, sort of at the beginning stages, to show you that things change with time, is quite surprisingly, not very long ago, I think it was right at the end of last year, 2 villages in Japan, in Hokkaido, which is the northern island in Japan, expressed interest in being considered as a host for their geologic repository. The Japanese have had lots of starts and stops about trying to find a place to dispose of their spent nuclear fuel. They have quite a bit of it, and they have geologic and seismic issues that make it very challenging. And so right now we're starting to see the dialogue occur between these remote Japanese villages and the organization responsible in Japan for the repository program. And predictably, we're also starting to see some opposition to the consideration. I think you can expect in lots of places that when you begin a process like this, there's going to be opposition. And the question is, can you over time work in a way that brings together parties, that builds trust, that brings alignment so that ultimately the organization that needs to solve the problem and the communities that are going to be affected by the problem see this as a win-win-win. And that brings us to one example that I thought I would mention to you briefly. There is an operating repository in this country. It's been operating for over a decade. It does not dispose of spent nuclear fuel. It cannot dispose of spent nuclear fuel, but it does dispose of radioactive waste that is long-lived. It's radioactive for a long time. It comes out of our defense program, and it's called the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, although almost everyone today calls it WIP. It's in a area of southern New Mexico next to a town called Carlsbad. Carlsbad was a mining town, potash mining, for a long, long time, and as with many mining towns, went from boom to bust when potash mining went bust, and a few leaders of the community and at the state level understood that the federal government was looking for a place to build a repository and literally went to the federal government and said, can we have a conversation about this? This began a literally 25-year process of dialogue and negotiation and argument amongst a variety of folks, both in the community where they were very much in favor and more in favor with time of hosting a facility, to the state level where the population centers and the state government were hundreds of miles away, but pretty much adamant against bringing spent radioactive waste into the community. And over time, they worked with the federal government and reached an agreement that allowed for what I would call a win-win-win. It's a much longer story, but basically the story is that the local community of Carlsbad got to host a repository in which what's called transuranic defense waste is in place. That facility operates for a long time. It's brought jobs, it's brought science, it's brought technology, it's brought notoriety, it's brought all kinds of potential economic, social, and political victories, if you will, to the local community. It's allowed them to thrive in ways that they did not foresee. And by and large, they're very, very happy with that experience. It's not perfect, but it's very, very happy. And many people would like to see their mission expanded because they want to see WIP continue and they want to see it grow. At the state level, the state wanted to see a number of things happen and they negotiated them very successfully. One of them was the fact that the federal government gave the governor of New Mexico money to establish his own independent group of experts to oversee the development of the waste isolation pilot plant so that he had his own independent group that he could have confidence in, and they were a pain in the neck to DOE when DOE didn't do things the way the state thought they should. But when the DOE finally did things the way that they thought they should, those people who were also highly qualified scientists and engineers were willing to tell the governor this time they did it right. So there was a trust building and a capacity building capability that made a big difference. There was a lot of opposition in Santa Fe, which is hundreds of miles away from the WIP facility, but the concern was that the waste, much of which was in Idaho, would go down through the streets of Santa Fe. And so there was an agreement reached that a bypass would be funded and built by the Department of Energy around Santa Fe. And today there is a bypass around Santa Fe as a result of this agreement. And interestingly enough, that bypass is where much of the economic vitality and growth of Santa Fe has occurred in the last decade or so. So these are examples of the kinds of lessons we can learn both from what's happening overseas and what has happened in the U.S. of both the right way to do things, the way that seemed to breed success, and also to identify those windows of opportunity, whether they be political, social, or economic, where we can work together so that everyone feels like this is something that is benefiting all of the folks who are likely to be impacted. And that's all I'll say at this point. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. And I think those are all really good lessons that we looked at as we worked on the strategic plan. So if we go ahead then to the next slide, slide 31, what we wanted to do here is in the following slides provide a brief capsule summary of what's actually in the strategic plan document. The document itself is over 150 pages. And so in the next sort of 10 slides here, we wanted to give you what we saw as the major strategic takeaways. So if you go on to slide 32, I think that one of the most critical takeaways has to do with consolidated offsite interim storage. And that our finding in our analysis is that transferring the Song's spent nuclear fuel to an offsite consolidated interim storage facility is likely to clear the site decades earlier than any form of a permanent repository program. And it'll be much closer in alignment with the current Song's decommissioning plan and schedule. I'll talk more about the repository in a moment, and that's not to say that we don't need a repository. It just means that in terms of the time sequencing, moving to a offsite storage facility is likely to move the fuel much quicker. And in the plan document itself, we looked at several different variations of what a consolidated interim storage facility might look like. And I'll go through each of these, the three major ones being a private consolidated interim storage facility, the second one being the federal government building such a facility, and third, some possible other innovative variations of regional or multi-utility, or for that matter, a Songs only offsite interim storage facility. And the opportunities and challenges and the uncertainties for each are different, and they were all very separately addressed. So if you go to slide 33, this talks about the non-federal consolidated interim storage facility options. And I think, as everyone knows, there are two such proposed facilities currently in the NRC licensing process, one in Texas and the second one in New Mexico. The New Mexico one being adjacent to the WIP facility that Tom described a few minutes earlier. What we know about these two facilities and the licensing processes is that they are both on a track where they could receive their licenses this year. In our assessment of the license conditions, though, what we found is that there are some significant uncertainties regarding the costs and the liability provisions that would flow from those license provisions into actual storage contracts for third-party entities such as Songs. And these have a significant impact on the potential costs and liability for two Songs if the co-owners decided to enter into a contract to utilize either storage facility. The other thing that we are seeing recently is that we're beginning to see some opposition in state government as well as litigation. And in particular, in the case of the New Mexico facility, with the change in the governorship several years ago, there's been a change in the state government's posture with respect to the New Mexico facility, and the governor and the state agency heads have now expressed opposition for various reasons. There also has been litigation filed against the NRC licensing process for both facilities, and impossible at this point to predict when and how that will get resolved. And then another major uncertainty there on the lower right-hand side is the question of taxpayer reimbursement. Right now, as the spent nuclear fuel sits in the Songs facility, the cost for maintaining those facilities is being reimbursed through a settlement agreement with the federal government and being paid out of the judgment fund of the U.S. Treasury. if the Song's co-owners were to consider entering into a storage contract to move the spent fuel to one of these two facilities, there would be questions as to whether or not what costs would be continue to be eligible for reimbursement. And the one cost in particular that would be the most uncertain is shipping costs. I think clearly it's possible to demonstrate that the cost for the operation and maintenance might be comparable depending upon how the some of the resolution of some of the cost issues are, but the shipping costs would be clearly an additional cost. Now, while these facilities are proceeding entirely as private sector initiatives, we also found in our analysis that if the federal government were to step in and take some role as providing, perhaps being the contractor for services or some other role in assisting these facilities, that could help substantially in resolving cost and liability uncertainties. Going to the next slide.
Before you do that, just a second, Joe. Pause. This is such an important issue that I just want to see if any members have any questions about this. I want to just say that one of the areas where the report is surprising reading and sobering is exactly on this issue of the interim storage facility, private interim storage facilities. And I'm just curious, should we be reading the report as saying that this option is actually a lot less viable than folks originally thought because a federal option is really what's needed to deal with the title questions and cost questions? Or, as you say, in I think page 101 of volume 2 of your report, not to quote things too depth, but there's a kind of hybrid mode where there would be federal use of the private facility. Is that what we should be thinking about as the right approach with regard to these two facilities, the one in New Mexico and the one in Texas, where I think the politics in New Mexico are getting tougher by the day, but Texas is still there?
No, thanks for that question, David. And in our assessment, we did find that looking at it from the standpoint of a third-party entity such as Songs, working with one of these two facilities, such as, for example, the Holtec facility in New Mexico, there are these cost and liability issues that need to be resolved. And we wanted to be very careful not to be too determinative about these, because obviously they're going to be a matter for negotiation. And obviously our point is that for the Songs co-owners, it's going to be a tough negotiation to get terms and conditions that will be acceptable. And to your point, we did find that a hybrid option, that if the federal government were to step in and become the contractor, and that the federal government would then take the title and allow the fuel to be stored here, would help substantially in resolving those uncertainties. And given the fact that the design and the licensing for both of these facilities is so far along in the process, that this hybrid idea may in fact offer the best path of all the variations that we looked at the moment for a consolidated interim storage facility.
Okay, thank you very much. We should let you go on. I don't see any other comments. I do want to say that we need to find a way to get all these different options down to a shorter list of places where we could really make a difference, especially at the federal level. And I'm sure we'll come back to that conversation when we talk about what one does with all this information and the consortium. So let you go on, Joe.
Okay. All right. Well, then I can go on then to slide 34. This talks about a federal consolidated interim storage facility. And again, just to remind you, Congress did appropriate $20 million to DOE in the current fiscal year to begin work on this option. Now, this option is attractive in a number of respects. The first is that obviously it transfers the title. It allows for the transfer of the title and the liability from the Songs co-owners to the federal government. And so it also, going down to the fourth bullet, it has no additional cost to current customers. And it also allows the phase out of the current taxpayer expense to reimburse for storage through the judgment fund. The issue here is one of timing. For this federal consolidated interim storage facility, basically the Department of Energy is starting from scratch. And so there would be some significant implementation uncertainties over siting and licensing. And both the congressional language and the statements from the administration are that any such federal consolidated interim storage facility would be cited under a consent-based process. So having said that, it's hard to put a specific figure on it, but as you can see in those second and third check marks there, we're saying that we're looking at probably at least 10 years to site and license and build the facility using a consent-based process. And probably once it opens, and I think this is another key point, obviously not all the spent fuel is going to be moved overnight. And that process, particularly for a large scale facility that's going to be taking fuel from many locations, it could take another 10 years or more to completely clear the Song site of all the spent nuclear fuel. So when you contrast this to the first option of a private consolidated facility, it then leads you to this notion, as we just discussed, David, that some form of a hybrid solution here may be the best way to marry the work that's been done to date on the private facilities with bringing in the role of the federal government to deal with the cost and the title transfer and the liability issues. So if we go on to the next slide.
Ted Quinn wanted to ask a question for the slide.
Yeah, this is Ted Quinn. I'm very excited by what you're covering today. It seems like the first time I've seen such a good in-depth discussion. I remember back to when John Kotek handled the consent-based siting program that many participated from the CEP. And I'm wondering if you see a delta between the consent-based siting that would be done for a federal facility versus one that was done for a private facility, Joe?
Well, that's a good question, Ted, because the two private facilities that are in the licensing process right now, although they were developed with some form of consultation with the state and local governments, was not a full-blown consent-based process as would be the case with a federal facility. And in fact, with the change, as I said, in the leadership in the governorship in both Texas and New Mexico, the current governors have been less inclined, to say the least, to be supportive as were the previous governors. And so not having that consent-based process that might lead to some form of an agreement does create risk that with a change of administrations, then there could be an issue. And as I said, we're seeing that issue now arise particularly in New Mexico. So having a consent-based process, while it might take a little bit longer in its evolution, gets you to a place that has greater certainty that you'll be able to implement over the longer term. Does that help answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Okay, I want you to continue on, Joe.
Okay, if we go on to slide 35, I did want to briefly summarize some of the other alternatives that we looked at. One was obviously looking at the possibility of a multi-utility storage facility at an existing ISFC. On the one hand, this has a certain attractiveness because an existing ISFC already has an NRC license. And so amending that license is a lot easier than starting from scratch. And also, it also potentially has some economies of scale in terms of cost sharing. this option was specifically identified in the consent agreement, and we were asked to look at the alternative for consolidating Song's spent nuclear fuel at the Palo Verde nuclear power plant station. But in our work and in previous work done by SCE, the Palo Verde owners have made it very clear that they are opposed. And during the course of our study, no other party has stepped forward with a willingness to enter into such an agreement. We also looked at an alternative is that what if we simply moved the current Song's ISFAC to a new location at a new site that was not on the current Song's site. And that what we found is that that could be a very lengthy process and a very costly one, and one that presents a significant cost risk to Song's customers because of the cost for this might have to be borne through the decommissioning trust funds. In particular, looking at the idea of moving the ISFAC across I-5, so to speak, to another location on Camp Pendleton, we have been in communication with the officials at Camp Pendleton, and they've made it again very clear that moving the Song's spent nuclear fuel anywhere else on Camp Pendleton would be inconsistent with its national security mission in terms of its training activities. And so this, for cost reasons as well as for acceptance reasons, this did not look to be a feasible option. And then lastly, while we didn't look at this in great detail, we simply note that within the state of California, there are common interests among the nuclear utilities that currently hold spent nuclear fuel. And in particular, right now, when you look statewide, California customers have prepaid almost $2 billion when you look at the accrued interest for nuclear waste disposal services to the federal government. And that by 2025, when the last nuclear plant facility shuts down, California will, as a state, will become the largest holder of spent nuclear fuel from shut down nuclear plants. And then last but not least, although the specifics are different at each facility, we have 3 separate spent nuclear fuel storage facilities that are along the California coastline. And so we think that this might create some commonality of interest, particularly when we begin to talk about coalition action to move forward on a national program. So I can stop here if anyone has questions. If not, we can move on to the next slide.
I don't see any questions here, so why don't we move on? Thanks, Joe.
All right. Slide 36. This gets to the issue about the permanent repository. And again, I want to emphasize that getting to a permanent geologic repository is absolutely essential. While we focus in the strategic plan about consolidated interim storage facilities, making progress on a repository is going to be critical to also assuring a host community that any storage facility is truly a temporary storage facility. The problem that we have now is that the proposed Yucca Mountain repository has essentially been deconstructed. And also now over a 10-year period, we've had successive administrations as well as successive Congresses that have been unwilling to take action to impose the repository against the wishes of the state. As I mentioned earlier, Secretary Granholm has now affirmed that the Biden administration's approach here to a permanent repository will be one of a consent-based approach. And then as Tom Isaacs pointed out earlier, we think that this is going to have to be a stepwise, very measured program moving forward, and one that will no doubt span decades. But the last point, I think the critical point is, despite the fact that this will take much longer to mature, the early restart is absolutely merited as a way to kind of supplement the pursuit of an offsite storage facility. And then last but not least, down at the bottom of the slide, we simply wanted to point out that we also, in the strategic plan, looked at some other alternatives that we consider to be a little bit more over the horizon alternatives. And in particular, looked at the idea of deep borehole disposal, which we think could emerge as a disposal alternative. But right now, it is sufficiently immature in the sense that there's no current regulatory framework for a deep borehole disposal facility, and that really that from what we've seen, while there's some interesting ideas, they require much further technical development. So again, stop here for a moment if anyone has any questions.
I'm not.
If not, I'm going to move on to transportation. And if Brian Gutherman, if you're on the line, I'm going to call on you for a few moments to summarize this one slide that addresses the conceptual transportation plan.
But just a moment, Martha McNicholas.
Joe, could refresh my memory again, the WIP site that is currently processing spent, I assume, weapons fuel from the government. That's not nearly big enough to accommodate any sort of waste that we would have. Is that a valid assessment?
I would, well,
Joe,
Tom, you want to comment on that, or?
your choice.
Why don't you go ahead and then I'll maybe add to it.
Yeah. The waste that goes into WIP is not spent nuclear fuel from the weapons program. It is what's called transuranic waste, which are things like gloves and filters and uniforms, things that have been contaminated over time that have the potential of being radioactive for a very long time periods, but they have no heat associated with them.
Okay.
That makes a big difference. And WIP was licensed or certified by the EPA, not licensed by the NRC. So you couldn't put spent nuclear fuel into WIP, even if it could accommodate it, which it cannot.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
Okay. All right. Well, why don't I go on then to the next slide, slide 37. And I don't know if Brian is not on or not. If not, I'll go through this.
Brian is on, but Brian, did you want to go through this?
He's not in a position to be able to speak to it. I
Okay.
can, or you can.
No,
Joe,
I'm
whatever.
happy to go through this, and Elizabeth Helvey's on the call also, who worked on this. We separately prepared what was called the transportation plan, which was the volume 3 of the 3 volumes series. We're not going to go through this in any detail tonight, but we did have this one slide here to address the issue of transportation readiness. And what we've documented in the conceptual transportation plan is the fact that there is a very long history of safe shipments of spent nuclear fuel. There have been incidents that have occurred, but they have been managed and they have not resulted in any significant adverse impacts. Nonetheless, we would anticipate that any large-scale shipment of spent nuclear fuel can be expected to draw significant public interest and concern. In the conceptual transportation plan, we describe how the spent nuclear fuel would be prepared and shipped with various layers of protection for both the canisters and the transportation casks. And that in addition to that, a key element of any transportation plan is to make sure that local emergency responders along the transportation route are trained and ready and available to act to any kind of incident. One of the things that we pointed out is that the cost just to prepare for transportation shipment could be substantial, on the order of $100 million. Again, as we pointed out earlier, if the federal government does not take title at the plant site, at the gate, some of these costs could accrue to the utility customers and become an additional burden on the decommissioning trust funds. And then last but not least, we pointed out that the preparations for transportation off-site could take a significant amount of time. So we might be looking at, a decade or more. And again, and we made a series of recommendations then for actions that could begin now, again, to move in parallel with everything else to prepare for transportation shipments once that window of opportunity presents itself. So if there's no questions on that, I'll go on to slide 38.
I think, Martha, your hand is a legacy hand from before. Is that right? Okay.
Okay, slide 38. So each of these options that we've talked about have some significant uncertainty in terms of schedule, cost, public acceptance. Because of that, the final formulation of our plan necessitated that we describe these options in terms of a large portfolio. And the idea of the portfolio is at any given time, you're not quite sure who's going to be the winner or the loser, but you want to keep all of these alternatives on the table. And in particular, some of the major uncertainty factors are congressional legislation, appropriations, administrative action, what the NRC may do, and what state and local governments might act on. And then all of these are subject to delay and political change, as we are seeing now in the states of Texas and New Mexico, for example. And even despite our best engineering cost estimates, once you throw schedule uncertainty into any program, it could have significant impact on costs. And then last but not least, the actions of state and local governments, even though they are not part of the NRC licensing process, they can cause significant delays or prevent implementation. That then leads us into this transition as to an action plan would keep all of these alternatives on the table, but could set priorities for early action while maintaining optionality and flexibility, so that the action plan can shift over time depending upon changed circumstances. The next slide, slide 39, then summarizes really the key role that the federal government holds in terms of policy, legal, and financial responsibility. And again, we did our own historical research here, and we're able to document the fact that going back to as early as the 1950s, there was a general understanding that the federal government would take responsibility for high-level spent nuclear waste disposal. That understanding evolved over time and was finally codified in the 1982 Nuclear Waste Policy Act. The federal government also holds over $41 billion in fees right now with the accrued interest to pay for disposal services. And then last but not least, the federal government has other authorities, including the Price-Anderson Act, that provides a framework for liability protection, including transportation of spent nuclear fuel. So what we see as the first step here is the resumption of federal government leadership on both storage and on permanent disposal. And we are felt very positive by the actions, as I described earlier, that Congress took at the end of the last year, and the early statements by Senator Granholm as part of her confirmation process. So if we go to slide 40, then what we see as needed here is a coalition action effort to create the momentum for federal action. Clearly, SONG's spent fuel co-owners really cannot do this all by themselves. but they can be a catalyst for change. And I think that's really the key, one of the key takeaways that we wanted to leave all of you with this evening. And we think that the interests of all the stakeholders can best be heard through a unified effort that focuses on this common objective. And that last but not least, again, going back to looking at this from a statewide perspective, we see a lot of potential common interests statewide that could act as an opportunity to further expand what would be a locally developed coalition effort. And then slide 41, again, as I said earlier, federal action is essential, but we still need optionality and flexibility. And that would include not only establishing federal leadership and also continuing to execute safely and effectively on the current decommissioning plan. And so if I go to my last slide, slide 42, here's our notions about what the key foundational pillars are for a national spent fuel agenda. The first being to reaffirm federal responsibility for addressing the title and liability issues. The second, to move forward on a national consolidated interim storage program. And again, we think that both the federal, the private, and the hybrid options should continue to be move forward and again, see which one will best address the challenges in front of it. In tandem with that, work on the permanent geologic repository with stakeholder engagement and consent. One fourth pillar being organization and funding. Right now, there is no separate organization within the federal government, within the Department of Energy, that is responsible for spent nuclear fuel management. That office was also de-established when Yucca Mountain was deconstructed. And so one of the things that has to be done is a federal program organization needs to be built back. And then last but not least, as we pointed out in the conceptual transportation plan, we need to prepare for transportation readiness. And that means making some investments in the infrastructure and also for the federal government to address issues related to scheduling and also to emergency management training. So with that, I will stop here for any other general questions or comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe. So John Taylor?
Yeah, hi, Joe. I was wondering about federal responsibility. Would that take, or could that take place with the spent nuclear fuel, like at San Onofre, still in the ISFAC, or would it have to take place once it starts transportation?
It's a good question, John. And historically, the federal government has taken the position that they would only take title at the fence line as part of the process of moving it. The idea of the federal government taking title at the ISFAC has been raised from time to time. In the strategic plan, we did not look into that in any great detail. It is technically possible. It does raise also its own set of issues in terms of having the federal government owning the spent fuel at a facility that is still being owned and managed by the utility. So I'm not sure that there's any significant benefit there by just simply transferring title at the site. And I don't know, I'll defer to Tom Isaacs if he wanted to add anything more to that.
No, thank you, Joe. I think you said it just right. I don't see a substantial benefit, and I think it would be a very tough mountain to climb.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So I'm just mindful of the time here and would be very keen to hear more about what we do with all this very helpful information. So for that, we're going to have two discussions. First, Doug Bowder is going to talk about what SCE and the other co-owners intend to do with regard to implementation of the strategic plan. So Doug, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. So if you advance to slide 44, please, Julie. Okay, good. Thank you. So we're kind of in a unique position here at Songs. We're on U.S. Navy land. We really have a strong interest in environmental stewardship and restoring the land to its original condition. And that's going to involve removing the fuel safely from Songs. And so we understand that we could be the ones that have to be the catalyst for change here. Change must occur. It's got to be done in a safe way. And we're willing to take that on. So there is a strong need for us to return the site to the U.S. Navy. We're in discussions with the Navy now about the actual decommissioning work that will occur years forward after the fuel is removed. And we have to consider our customers and local communities. So we've explored these issues. In considering our customers, we don't think it's meeting any sort of good principles to pass on a huge cost to customers for things like shipping, for which the federal government is ultimately responsible, as Joe indicated, for taking title at the gate under the current Nuclear Waste Policy Act. We've explored those transportation issues. Fundamentally, when it comes down to it, we want to be a catalyst for change, and we want to continue to update and safely store the fuel on site. Julie, if you could advance to slide 45, that'd be great. Okay, so I went through this slide at the beginning. I'll kind of cover it quickly again in a nutshell. We think that restarting the federal program to actively manage the spent fuel and its disposition in two ways, a federal geologic repository in tandem with a consolidated interim facility with government support so that it can be done properly. And we also I think that consent-based siting is the way to go. Although, as Joe indicated, in the plan, it talks about additional time that would be required for that. It would be worth it, though, in the end, to have it sited properly and with consent of the local communities. We are willing to take action to influence legislative priorities, and that's part of what we are working through as we are developing the coalition for taking action. And then finally, I'll mention it again, near-term efforts to keep the fuel safe at the site until an off-site facility is available is top of mind for me and for the Songs staff here. Next slide, please. So this slide really talks about foundational issues and building blocks. We've covered some of this material already in the content that Joe presented, but just to go through it again, foundationally, the federal government needs to step up and take on title and liability for removal of the fuel. That needs to happen. That support is required. And then a national program with autonomy and reliable funding is important. Currently, just to reiterate how we deal with our fuel here, I think it was already mentioned, but we safely store it. We build facilities to expand, as we did with the Holtec facility. We keep track of those costs. We actually pursue the Department of Energy for those costs. When we recover a portion of those costs, we actually refund those back to our customers. That's the way we've been doing business now since before the plant even shut down. And then looking at the building blocks, we want to be ready for moving the fuel when it's time for pickup. As we outlined in the plan, it could take 10 years or more for that entire activity to take place once a facility is available, but bottom line is we want to be ready. We know that the federal government must support some sort of interim storage would be the best way to handle it, along with permanent geologic repository, because the two need to work hand in hand. And then on the upper right-hand corner of this slide, the advocacy piece is hugely important. And I'll say it again, we don't mind being the ones as the catalyst for change here. Next slide, please. You've seen this before, I think, in prior meetings, but this goes into the area of our commitment to safely store the fuel. And I'm not going to go through each of these separate areas, but right now, our big focus is on aging management. We've put together an inspection and maintenance plan that we think is top notch, in some ways industry leading, and we're continuing to learn and improve as we go forward, because although we don't want to do this, we don't desire to do this, our desire is to return the land to the Navy and do a complete environmental remediation. We need to be able to safely store the fuel for the time that it takes before we can move it from songs. Next slide, please. Engagement is a really big principle for us here. I just want to go through a couple of things that have occurred over time for which we took action. Real-time radiation data. We received input on, could we put this in place for our system? We took actions to do that through the permitting process at the facility and gaining our permits to deconstruct. We now have a real-time ISFSI radiation monitoring system with reports to the California Department of Public Health, and so the program is up and running, and we continue to do that, and we will continue it for the foreseeable future. Dry cask storage robustness, frequent communications regarding our defense in depth efforts there, things we've done to make our casks more robust, batch releases of wastewater. In today's content, Vince showed a slide showing how we process the water. We've talked about this in detail at other meetings. We make a 48-hour advance public notice now as part of decommissioning for those releases, and we will continue to do that. And then very significantly, with help from the panel and a lot of facilitation by David, we went ahead and held this Beyond Design Basis Events, or Outlier Events meeting, to answer a lot of questions and study things that are in the realm of possible but not very unlikely. And finally, relocating the spent fuel off-site. We took a lot of input here, and we developed the action plan. So we really want to continue to engage and adjust what we do as we go forward. Next slide. This is kind of just what it says, help wanted. We can't do this alone. We've started the coalition formation, and we think that's the right thing to do at this time, and we're hoping it grows, and we're hoping we can use it to cause the right type of influence through this panel and through a lot of other channels for which we will undergo to continue to form and expand the coalition. Fortunately, Orange County Supervisor Lisa Bartlett and San Diego County Supervisor Jim Desmond have both stepped forward to serve as co-chairs on the coalition, and I believe Supervisor Bartlett is ready to speak, David, on how that's going to look in the next couple of slides.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll give the floor to Lisa and Jim in just a moment, but let me ask first, Dan Stetson, did you want to raise a question?
No, I'm good. Thank you, David. Just having troubles connecting.
Okay, thank you very much. That's the theme of 2020, a year that continues on. I want to give the floor then to Supervisor Lisa Bartlett.
Great. Thank you very much, and good evening, everyone. I know it's been a probably long day for us all, and great presentations with the Northwind presentation and then following up with the last presentation. Some good information, reminders of kind of where we've been and then yet where we are today, and the need for a really significant coalition moving forward. So I'm going to abbreviate some of my notes because so much good information has already been covered. So as supervisor for the 5th District in Orange County, I represent about 600,000 residents who live in very close proximity to songs. And I'm really proud tonight to introduce the Action for Spent Fuel Solutions Now, which is a new coalition. And I'm honored to co-chair this alongside San Diego County Supervisor Jim Desmond. As we know, the federal government has an obligation to remove the spent fuel. And this goes back to 1998, more than 2 decades ago. And despite the songs, ratepayers paying $1 billion into the fund to get it disposed of, we're still waiting. So we are always waiting for the federal government, and it's really time for them now to step up to fulfill its obligation. Over time, groups and organizations have called on the federal government to deliver a solution. And yet today we stand with 123 canisters of spent nuclear fuel on our coastline. So we know it's unacceptable. Our residents are concerned, businesses are concerned, the active military base is concerned, and we really need things to get moving in the right direction. And what is it going to take? I was in contact with Congressman Mike Levin the other day, and I want to thank him for his steadfast support on this very important and meaningful issue, and trying to get things done in Washington and get us moving in the right direction. So I think he will continue to be a big advocate for us. We know that it's going to be a battle, but it's a battle that we've got to get involved in to a greater level, and it's a battle that we think we can win. We know we can win it. It's just a matter of pushing from all angles to make this happen. And so we need that unified coalition, that unified voice that provides a diverse cross-section of the community to ensure that our message is heard loud and clear from California all the way to Washington, D.C. Our coalition includes members from environmental groups, organized labor, Native American leaders, the business community, and more. And we have a growing number of Orange County cities, including San Juan Capistrano and Newport Beach, that have come on to support us as well. And I know that in San Diego County, there are a number of cities that are joining us as well today as well, and moving forward into the future. We need to move forward as a cohesive unit, and we need each of you to lend your name to help us relocate the spent fuel off-site. So to join our cause and support our efforts, check out the new website, which is www.spentfuelsolutionsnow.com, where you can actually sign on as a supporting member. That would be great. And our message is very succinct and it's very clear. The federal government needs to take action. They need to step up and do what's right, and they need to start working on it now. Because as was indicated in the presentations, even if they pull the trigger today and we get the enabling legislation that we need for the funding for private and public lands, and all of the other logistical things to move forward, it's still going to take a significant period of time to actually get things in motion. We've got transport issues that we need to work through and a whole host of other things. So we've got to push to make this happen. You've got my confirmed commitment as co-chair of the Action for Spent Fuel Solutions Now Coalition that will make every single effort, turn every stone, and make sure that we get the action that we need. We need to advocate for the necessary federal legislation. As I indicated, all of these things that need to happen in order to make the first step take place, we've really got to get that enabling legislation at the federal level. That requires the funding, administrative policies and programs to create what we need for the interim storage and for a permanent repository. So while Southern California Edison is storing the spent fuel on site, the site really needs to be fully decommissioned and the land restored, returned back to the Navy, and the spent fuel's got to be relocated away from our coast. And a lot of people have said, well, why our plant? Why our priorities right now? We've been waiting an awful long time, and I know there are over 14 nuclear power plants in different stages of being decommissioned around the United States. Not all of them have millions of people right near the power plant. Not everyone is on an earthquake fault zone or has an active military base or other things that we have that are so critical to our environment here. We've only got one freeway that runs through the area. So in the event of a significant issue, it's going to be really difficult, if not impossible, to get everybody out of the area. So we have a set of really unique circumstances that, in my opinion, really pushes us up to priority level 1 in trying to get things done as quickly as possible for this particular nuclear power plant. So we need to urge Congress and the administration to take prompt action. And like other complex issues, we know it does take time, but this coalition, I think, is the right coalition with its stakeholders and members. It's the right time, and I'm really excited about everything coming together to have that big push to make things happen at the federal level. I look forward to working with all the coalition partners, especially Supervisor Desmond and Southern California Edison. And to that end, I'd like to now turn it over to my coalition co-chair, San Diego's 5th District Supervisor, Jim Desmond.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Lisa. I appreciate that. And I'll try to be brief here. I see our task as getting our cities, our electeds, our organizations, in both counties and beyond to, collaborate and work towards this combined effort. And as Supervisor Bartlett said, it's the federal government's time to act, but we got to be the catalyst. We got to kind of be the spark that lights that fire and gets, hopefully gets that movement. As Supervisor Bartlett said, I am the San Diego County's District 5 supervisor, which is North County, and Songs actually resides within my district. Camp Pendleton's in my district. So, we have to make movements towards a permanent solution to move the spent nuclear fuel. I feel very strongly about this. And as Supervisor Bartlett had mentioned, Congressman Levin, I was actually talking with his office today. They make a very good partner. I'm actually part of a task force with his office as far as trying to get this done and make this movement possible. So it's great to have him as a partner. We're going to welcome all people, communities, and organizations to work with us. And after today's presentation, this is going to be a Herculean effort. But I know if we've got everybody working together on this effort and within Southern California as best possible, we can make some progress. But I'm going to be bringing this coalition and its mission to the full board of the San Diego County Board of Supervisors so that we're able to garner as much support in San Diego County and then work with our cities and tribal communities and all the stakeholders. And basically everybody in San Diego County is trying to get them behind this effort. Like I said, working together, I know we can make some positive steps towards this long-term solution, and I look forward to serving and working with Supervisor Bartlett on this effort. Thank you very much.
Right. And Supervisor Desmond, before we move on, you brought up an important point. I'll be bringing this to my Board of Supervisors in the not too distant future as well, because it's important to have, as we know, the full board behind us in the county for us to move forward. So thank you.
Well,
thank you. Thanks to both of you. And in particular, I think it's important that we have the supervisors who represent the districts most adjacent to the plant co-leading this effort. And I want to also offer, if there are things that the community engagement panel can do to be helpful, I am confident we stand ready to play that role. So I want to pause for just a moment before we take a break and go to public comment to see if there are any members of the CEP who have any questions. I have one, but I want to hang back for a moment and just see whether there are any CEP members who have questions or comments that they'd like to make at this stage. Martha McNicholas?
Yes, with the inspiration from Supervisor Bartlett and Supervisor Desmond, I will plan to bring this to the Capistrano Unified Board of Trustees, probably in the form of a resolution in support of this coalition. I can't speak for the entire board right now, but I know we are the closest school district, I think. Very close anyway. So I will plan to bring it to our board for support of a resolution as well.
I would like to offer, I think one of the first tasks that we're going to have as the coalition is to create a resolution that can go to all the different agencies and all the different cities to buy on. And that would be an effort I think this coalition should, one of the first things we need to do.
So let me just ask the question to Jim and Lisa. What's your sense of how much we know about what we're asking for and what the strategic kind of reach is for that? Because you now have 3 volumes of material and 1 focused volume from Edison about what they want. It seems to me we got to figure out what we need and also what's feasible, and then how to go about getting it. What's your sense about where we are on that? That's not going to be the last word tonight, far from it, but where are we in that process?
Supervisor Desmond, go ahead.
To be honest with you, we're not very far in that process. We haven't really tonight's the first night, the announcement of the coalition, and I think, we have to meet and figure out how the next steps. we welcome your input, David, and several others, to make sure we're going positively. But I think really kind of our first, for my efforts, the way I see it is come up with a resolution and then go around to the different cities and see where we have support. I would imagine, it's going to be a no-brainer. Everybody wants the nuclear fuel moved, but then we have to maybe come up with a game plan as to how we mobilize these these different entities to spread that message and keep it moving.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, and David, I agree with Supervisor Desmond. We've come a long way, but we have so far to go. It's like we're been taking baby steps, and we've really got to accelerate that process. When you consider that, and I've been working with various groups, and when I was on the Dana Point City Council, this issue was top of mind, and that was in 2006. So we've all been working on this for many, many, many years now, and we've got to get that forward movement. One big focus of the coalition, it's going to be a very targeted, broad-based coalition that's going to be funded, and it's going to take a significant lobbying effort. We've got great legislators in Washington, D.C., but frankly, they've got to get lobbied. We need to get that enabling legislation, and in order to do that, we've got to get the attention of the legislators. We've got to get them writing, legislation and moving in the right direction. And with this coalition that will be well funded, we've all done in the past where we've had different groups going to DC and asking different things with different legislators. I know with the NRC right now, with the changes in the folks in the administration, there's a lot of unknowns with who's in charge of what and things that have been changed from the last administration to the current one. So we have to get that figured out. But people are going to be placed in positions, and hopefully we can get the coalition out there and start working through the process. It's going to be a multi-pronged process. Legislation is just one part of it. There are a whole host of other things that need to be done. But through the lobbying efforts, we want to get results, and that's something that we'll be laser focused on. So while we've had many voices in the past at many different times, this is going to be a very strong, broad-based, large, unified voice. And that's really what we need at this point. And I'm really excited about this because I think it's the first time in the last 10 or 15 years where I feel really passionate that we are going to get something done. We are going to get that forward movement that has been lacking for so long.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to see if anybody else from the CEP wants to comment on this before I say one more thing, and then we're going to go to a break. And I guess I would invite especially the elected officials in the CEP to carry these ideas back. Let's get some materials about what the coalition's going to be doing, carry it back to their communities, and explore interest, because I think probably once people have a chance to take a look at the opportunity here, we're going to see a lot of communities signing on and supporting this along the lines of what Martha said. I want to just comment briefly that as we go through the process of figuring out, in particular as you, the co-chairs, go through the process of figuring out what's our ask, what's feasible, what's important, let's also share some of that material with some of the other communities around the country that are going through a similar experience, because we're ultimately, if we're going to move things in Washington, we're going to need more allies. And there are efforts inside the industry to organize that kind of come and go. A lot of people on this call have been involved in the nuclear waste discussions in the country for a long time and are well connected. And I think there's just kind of a latent interest in working on the problem, but it hasn't crystallized into a game plan. And it may well be that this effort will produce exactly that game plan. And that's certainly my hope. And I'm keen to put every resource behind it feasible. So thank you very much. This is a full conversation. And a data-rich one. So we're going to take a 5-minute break. Then we're going to come back for public comment. I want to just say, if you want to raise a question, I see a number of members of the public have raised their hands. But in order to get on the list, you just click on the link that was on the slide in the beginning. And then also I've asked Sanjay to put that slide into the chat. So if you go to the chat, the very final item, well, nearly the final item, because Microsoft Teams likes to tell you every time somebody changes their favorite color, But if you go back to Sanjay's chat item of 7:06 p.m., you can click on that link and it'll take you right to the forum, put your name in there, and then you'll get the floor during the public comment period. But right now, let's take a 5-minute break. Okay, why don't we resume? Let me ask Manuel, do we need the placeholder slide up, or can we pull the slide down and see people?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, exactly. Let's do that. So, Julie, if you're on, if you can advance to the next slide, sorry, not advance. Let's see, how do we do that?
We stop share of some sort.
So, Julie, if you can stop sharing.
Might involve wire cutters.
Hold on, let me walk over. I'll work on that, David. I'm gonna step away.
Well, that's sorry to put a wrench in the works. So the first on our list is going to be Don Bill, and then it'll be Alice McNally. And so I want to see if Don Bill, if your microphone is on. I don't see you on the list here. Maybe we could go, while we sort that out, Alice McNally. We could take your comment first. So there we go. So could we open Alice McNally's line?
And David, while we're doing that, we sorry, I changed my answer. So we do have the timer on here, so it's one reason to keep the slide up.
Okay. Well, great. So could we open up Alice McNally's line? And I don't.
So Alice, please unmute your microphone to speak up.
Well, I don't see, Sandra, do you see Alice on the?
Yeah, well, we have Alice as a presenter, so we can't unmute somebody here.
Right, I see how it works.
It looks like I'm unmuted.
Okay, well, we can hear you. So Alice McNally, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, good evening. Working together to relocate the nuclear waste to a permanent home is to be commended. Meanwhile, the waste is stranded here indefinitely. Keeping it safer until it can be moved must be your first priority. Steps must be taken to store the nuclear waste safely until it can be moved. Step 1 is to create an emergency plan and increase inspections. Step 2, transfer the waste into thick-walled transportable casks. The present 5/8-inch thin canister